People assume betrayal announces itself. A confession, a mistake, a dramatic moment that explains everything. They're wrong. Betrayal usually slips in quietly, disguised as routine. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 41 years old. For the past 16 years, I've worked in corporate risk and compliance, the kind of work where companies call you when something feels off, but no one can explain why. Ironically, I didn't see it coming in my own life. My wife, Elena, and I had been married for 9 years. We had 2 children, Noah and Lily, and a life that looked stable from the outside. Good neighborhood, reliable schools, predictable routines, the kind of life people assume is safe. I spent my days helping companies identify internal threats, embezzlement, conflicts of interest, governance failures. I was good at it. Calm, methodical, never emotional. At home, I turned that part of myself off. Or at least, I thought I did. The night everything changed wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No suspicious texts lighting up a phone screen. It was a hotel receipt. I was reviewing expense statements for a mid-sized consulting firm, one of my clients, when I noticed a familiar name listed as a guest contact on a conference booking. Elena Harper. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence. Common name. Nothing more. But then I saw the room number. And the date. It was from the previous weekend. A weekend Elena told me she'd spent at a professional networking retreat with her business partner. I felt nothing at first. No panic. No anger. Just stillness. I checked again. Slowly. Carefully. The way I'd been trained. Same hotel. Same city. Same floor. What caught my attention wasn't that she'd been there. It was who paid for the room. The account wasn't hers. It belonged to Mark Ellison, her business partner of 3 years. A man I'd shaken hands with dozens of times. A man who'd eaten at my table, played board games with my kids. A man I trusted. I didn't confront Elena. Not because I was afraid, but because instincts honed over years of investigations told me something important. When something looks wrong, you don't rush. You observe. Over the next 2 weeks, I did nothing different. I woke up early, packed lunches, helped with homework, kissed Elena goodbye before work. I watched. Patterns emerged quickly. Phone calls that ended when I entered the room. Meetings that ran late, always late. New expenses explained vaguely, never clearly. What unsettled me most wasn't the possibility of an affair. It was the financial behavior. Joint accounts being accessed irregularly. Documents forwarded to personal emails. Unusual transfers between business and personal accounts. That was my world. And it was being violated. Mark had always struck me as ambitious, but sloppy. Big talker. Confident. The kind of man who mistakes charm for intelligence. I started to suspect that Elena wasn't just betraying me emotionally. She was helping him do something worse. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Elena mentioned, casually, that Mark had suggested restructuring their business to protect future earnings. Her words, not his. I asked what that meant. She shrugged. Legal stuff. You wouldn't find it interesting. That was when I knew. Because when someone says legal stuff without details, it usually isn't. I began reviewing publicly available filings connected to their company. Nothing invasive. Nothing unethical. Just records anyone with patience could access. The picture that formed was subtle, but unmistakable. Assets being repositioned. Liabilities shifted strategically. Ownership diluted quietly. Not random. Planned. The realization hit me late one night while I sat alone in my office, staring at a spreadsheet I hadn't intended to create. They weren't just planning a separation. They were planning an exit. One where I would carry the risk. One where my reputation, built over decades, would absorb the fallout. One where my children's stability would become collateral damage. And the worst part? They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I was too busy, too trusting, too focused on providing to question what was happening right in front of me. They were wrong. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. And clarity is dangerous, not because it's loud, but because it doesn't hesitate. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't cry. I opened a fresh notebook and wrote a single sentence across the first page. Understand everything before doing anything. They had no idea that the man they were quietly positioning as the fall guy spent his life dismantling schemes far less obvious than theirs. And this time, the stakes weren't corporate. They were personal. Once you've spent enough years studying risk, you learn an uncomfortable truth. People don't get caught because they're evil. They get caught because they repeat themselves. I didn't need passwords. I didn't need spyware. I didn't need access to anything that wasn't already visible. All I needed was patience. Elena and Mark were careful. Careful in the way amateurs think professionals are. They avoided obvious mistakes. No incriminating messages. No dramatic changes overnight. Instead, they made reasonable ones. The kind that look innocent unless you understand incentives. I started with time. Mark's calendar was public-facing. He used it to impress clients, not realizing it created a pattern. Meetings clustered late afternoons. Strategy sessions, always midweek. Travel that aligned too neatly with Elena's schedule. I compared those dates to expense reimbursements, then to bank timestamps, then to document edits on shared files. That was the thing about Mark. He loved efficiency. He reused templates, copied phrasing, left fingerprints without realizing it. Within days, I could map when decisions were made, who initiated them, and why. Elena was no passive participant. She was central. The business they ran together had started as legitimate. A boutique advisory firm focused on vendor negotiations for mid-sized companies. Nothing glamorous. Nothing illegal. But 6 months earlier, something had shifted. They'd introduced a holding entity. Then another. Ownership percentages changed quietly. Revenue streams rerouted through subsidiaries that existed only on paper. To most people, it would look like smart tax planning. To someone who reads risk disclosures for a living, it looked like preparing for a collapse. One evening, Elena mentioned that a client dispute might turn messy. I asked what she meant. She smiled and said, "You always worry too much." That smile told me more than her words. I started documenting, not emotionally, but professionally. Dates, statements, contradictions, financial flows. I wasn't building a case against my wife. I was building a timeline. At the same time, I watched my children. Noah was quieter than usual. Lily asked me once if I was moving out like Mark's friend did. I asked where she'd heard that. She shrugged. Mom said sometimes grown-ups live in different houses. That was the first time anger brushed against clarity. Not enough to cloud judgment. Enough to sharpen it. I realized then that Elena wasn't planning a conversation. She was planning a narrative. One where I was absent, distracted, uninvolved. A father who meant well, but didn't show up. And narratives matter. They matter in negotiations. They matter in settlements. They matter most when children are involved. I needed to understand how far she was willing to go. So I waited. The confirmation came accidentally, on her part. She forwarded an email to the wrong address. It wasn't explicit, just a draft memo titled Contingency Options. But the language was revealing. If Daniel resists restructuring. In the event of reputational pushback. Mitigation strategies regarding spousal interference. Spousal interference. That's what I was to them. An obstacle. Not a partner. Not a father. A variable to neutralize. I didn't confront her. Confrontation alerts people. It changes behavior. Destroys evidence. Pushes plans underground. Instead, I made one quiet decision. I separated my roles. At home, I remained exactly the man Elena believed I was. Busy, trusting, predictable. At work, I treated my own life like a hostile audit. I consulted an old colleague, not for help, but for perspective. I described a hypothetical client scenario, left names out, changed details. He listened, then said something that stayed with me. If they're moving assets before declaring conflict, he said, they're expecting litigation or leverage. That night, Elena told me she was considering taking some space. She framed it gently, thoughtfully, as if she were doing me a favor. I think we've both been stretched thin, she said. Maybe distance would help us reset. Reset? I nodded. Asked practical questions. How long? Where? What about the kids? She already had answers, which told me everything. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I asked her to put everything in writing so we could stay aligned. She agreed without hesitation. That was mistake number one. Because once people believe you're cooperative, they stop being cautious. Over the next week, she sent messages outlining expectations, living arrangements, financial contributions, custody, flexibility. Every word polished, every sentence framed to sound reasonable, and every message contradicted something else she'd said earlier. I cataloged it all. Meanwhile, Mark grew bolder. He started calling during evenings, leaving voicemails I didn't return, asking to grab a drink and talk things through like men. I declined politely. That irritated him. People like Mark mistake access for authority. When you remove access, they escalate. He sent one final message that confirmed my suspicions completely. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Everyone comes out better if we keep things clean. Clean. That word again. People only talk about cleanliness when they're worried about stains. That night, after Elena went to bed, I stood in the kitchen and looked around the house. Photos, toys, school projects taped to the fridge. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about protection. I realized then that whatever plan they were executing, it depended on one assumption. That I would react emotionally. That I would rush. That I would make mistakes. They were wrong. Because the most dangerous moment in any investigation isn't when you discover the truth. It's when you realize the other side has underestimated you completely. And they had. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I was preparing to make sure my children didn't grow up inside a lie crafted by people who thought outcomes could be engineered without consequences. The next phase wouldn't involve confrontation. It would involve positioning. And once positioning is complete, the outcome becomes inevitable. Every separation begins with a story, not the truth, the version that sounds clean enough to repeat. I realized that Elena and Mark weren't just preparing documents or moving money. They were rehearsing a narrative. One that would be told calmly, confidently, and often enough that it would begin to feel true. In their version, I wasn't betrayed. I was absent. Too busy. Too focused. Too emotionally unavailable to notice what was happening inside my own home. It was a clever angle. And a dangerous one. I started seeing it everywhere once I knew to look. Comments Elena made to friends while I was in the next room. Questions teachers asked during school meetings. Even the way neighbors spoke to me. Sympathetic, cautious, like I was someone who meant well, but didn't quite show up. The groundwork was already being laid. One afternoon, Noah's teacher asked if everything was okay at home. I smiled and said yes. That night, I stayed awake long after Elena fell asleep, thinking about how quickly perception becomes reality when left unchallenged. I wasn't angry yet. I was alert. The next step in their plan revealed itself sooner than expected. Elena asked me to attend a mediation consultation. Framed it as proactive, mature, something couples do when they want to minimize conflict. I agreed. The consultant's office was clean, neutral, designed to calm people down. The kind of place where uncomfortable truths are softened with neutral language. The consultant asked us to describe our concerns. Elena went first. She spoke gently, carefully, about loneliness, about feeling like a single parent, about a husband who was always working, always tired, always distracted. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. When it was my turn, I didn't contradict her. I didn't defend myself. I asked questions. How long had she felt this way? When did it start? What specifically did she feel I'd missed? Her answers were vague, generalized, inconsistent. The consultant noticed. That was important. After the meeting, Mark called me. He didn't bother with pleasantries. Elena's trying to do this the right way, he said. You should cooperate. Cooperate with what? I asked. With moving forward. There it was again. Moving forward always sounds harmless when you don't say from what. I asked him why he was so involved. He laughed. Someone needs to keep things from getting ugly. I thanked him for his concern and ended the call. That night, I made my first visible move, but not the one they expected. I hired an independent family law advisor. Not to initiate anything. To understand exposure. I presented everything as hypothetical. A client case. A man whose spouse was restructuring finances before a separation. The advisor didn't hesitate. If this goes uncontested, she said, he'll lose leverage immediately. Especially if there's a claim of emotional absence. What if he stays calm? I asked. That helps, she replied. But only if he documents everything. That word again. Document. I began keeping a detailed log. School pickups. Doctor appointments. Bedtime routines. Every day I was present. Every night I came home. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten. I simply created a record that contradicted the story they were telling. At the same time, Elena became colder. More distant. She stopped pretending we were a team. The kids noticed. So did I. Mark started showing up more often. Always under the guise of support. Bringing groceries. Helping with logistics. Sitting at our table like he belonged there. I let him. That was mistake number 2. Because when people think they're winning, they get careless. One evening, while he was there, he made an offhand comment about when things are finalized. I asked what he meant. He froze, just for a moment. Then smiled. You know, when everything settles. I nodded. But inside, the picture sharpened. They weren't waiting to see what I'd do. They were counting on my silence. The turning point came with an email Elena didn't expect me to read. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't encrypted. It was forwarded accidentally to an address she thought I didn't check. A draft outline titled Post-Separation Stability. It included talking points, custody preferences, financial assumptions, and one line that changed everything. Daniel is unlikely to contest if positioned as disengaged. Unlikely. That word burned. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet of a house that already felt divided. I didn't feel panic. I felt resolve. Because once someone decides you won't fight back, the moment you do becomes decisive. I didn't need to destroy their story. I needed to replace it with something undeniable. The next morning, I told Elena I agreed we should formalize things. She looked relieved. I said I wanted everything transparent, documented, and handled respectfully. She agreed instantly. That was mistake number 3. Transparency cuts both ways. From that moment on, every meeting, every message, every decision passed through a lens they didn't realize I was holding. They thought they were managing a transition. I was preparing to take control of the outcome. Not through confrontation. Through consistency. Because when two stories collide, the louder one doesn't always win. The one supported by evidence does. And I had already begun collecting mine. The funny thing about narratives is that they only work as long as everyone agrees to repeat them. Elena and Mark assumed I would. They assumed I'd stay quiet. Cooperative. Reasonable. The man who nods, signs, and accepts what's framed as inevitable. They misread the silence. I wasn't agreeing. I was aligning. The first crack appeared during a routine school meeting. Nothing dramatic. Just a scheduled check-in with Noah's teacher about reading progress. Elena attended too. Mark, of course, offered to wait in the car. During the meeting, the teacher pulled out a folder and smiled at me. Daniel's been very involved this semester, she said. He volunteers more than most parents. The kids light up when he's here. Elena blinked. Just once. But I saw it. The teacher continued, flipping pages. He's attended every conference, every event. I wish more parents had that consistency. No accusation had been made. No defense offered. And yet, the room shifted. Elena tried to recover with a light laugh. Well, he's been making more time lately. The teacher nodded politely. That's wonderful. It's been steady all year. All year. That phrase followed us out of the building. In the car, Elena was quiet. Not angry. Calculating. The next crack came from their own paperwork. They'd sent a proposed separation framework, informal, preliminary, just to discuss. It included assumptions about custody flexibility and financial support. I responded with a single request. Let's attach timelines and sources to each claim, I wrote. Just for clarity. Mark replied within minutes. That's unnecessary. It wasn't. Within 48 hours, the framework unraveled under its own weight. Claims about my absence contradicted school logs. Assertions about financial control conflicted with bank records showing joint decision-making. They hadn't expected scrutiny. They'd expected compliance. Mark started calling more frequently. Less friendly now. More impatient. This doesn't need to turn adversarial, he said during one call. It won't, I replied. As long as everything is accurate. Silence on the other end. Elena, meanwhile, tried a different tactic. She grew emotional. Cried in front of friends. Spoke about the strain of carrying everything alone. The narrative softened, but it didn't strengthen. Because emotion without evidence fades quickly, especially when the other side isn't reacting. The real collapse happened during mediation session number 2. This time, Elena arrived with notes. Prepared. Composed. So did I? The mediator asked us to discuss parenting arrangements. Elena described a structure that sounded generous on the surface. Flexible visits. Open communication. What's best for the kids? I thanked her, then slid a document across the table. A calendar. Every pickup. Every drop-off. Every overnight. Color-coded. Time-stamped. 16 months of consistency. I don't object to flexibility, I said calmly. I object to inaccurate characterizations. The mediator studied the pages. Mark shifted in his seat. The mediator looked up. This level of involvement suggests shared custody at minimum. Elena opened her mouth, then closed it. That was the moment I stopped defending myself and started being believed. After that session, the tone changed. Emails became cautious. Conversations shorter. The confidence that had fueled their planning evaporated. Mark made his final mistake a week later. He sent an email meant for Elena, copied to me by accident. Just one sentence. If he keeps pushing, we may need to revisit leverage. Leverage. That word again. I forwarded the email to the mediator and my advisor without commentary. No accusations. No threats. Just context. That afternoon, I received a call from Elena. Her voice was tight. Why are you doing this? Doing what? I asked, turning everyone against me. I'm not, I replied. I'm letting them see what's already there. She hung up. The next morning, Mark requested a private conversation. I declined. From that point on, everything shifted decisively. The mediator began insisting on documentation. The advisors started asking uncomfortable questions. The assumptions Elena and Mark relied on stopped being accepted at face value. Their story didn't explode. It simply stopped working. That's how most manipulations fail, not with drama, but with exposure. Elena grew quieter. Mark became distant. And I remained steady. The children noticed the change before anyone else. Noah asked one night if things were less weird. I told him yes. Lily hugged me longer than usual at bedtime. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I stayed consistent. Because consistency is what dismantles lies. By the end of that month, it was clear the separation would happen, but not on their terms. They'd planned a clean exit with me absorbing the consequences. Instead, they were facing a process grounded in facts they couldn't bend. And the most unsettling realization for them? I wasn't angry. I wasn't vengeful. I wasn't emotional. I was composed. And composed people are the hardest to manipulate. They still believed they could salvage something. They were wrong. Because the next phase wasn't about mediation. It was about accountability. And once accountability enters the room, stories lose their power. Mark disappeared first. Not physically, not yet, but socially, strategically, the way people do when they realize the room no longer belongs to them. He stopped attending meetings, stopped answering emails directly. Messages came filtered through Elena now, softened and vague, stripped of the confidence he'd worn like armor. That alone told me something important. People who believe in their position don't retreat quietly. People who realize they're exposed do. The financial unraveling began with a question no one expected the mediator to ask. Who benefits if the restructuring fails? The room went still. Elena looked at Mark. Mark looked at the table. I didn't speak. The mediator repeated the question, slower this time. If the company collapses under liability, who walks away clean? Mark cleared his throat. That's speculative. Then it should be easy to answer, the mediator said. It wasn't. Because once incentives are examined openly, intent stops hiding. The advisor Elena had brought in, someone Mark recommended, began reviewing the ownership layers more carefully. Transfers that had been framed as temporary suddenly looked permanent. Revenue streams meant to stabilize the business had been quietly redirected. To Mark. Not shared. Not protected. Isolated. The advisor frowned. These arrangements disproportionately shield one party. Elena's face changed. Not dramatically. Just a subtle tightening around the eyes. That was the moment doubt finally broke through loyalty. She asked Mark to explain. He deflected. Said it was standard. Said it was temporary. Said it was for everyone's protection. But he didn't meet her eyes. That night, Elena searched for answers herself. She didn't need my help. Once trust fractures, people look differently at what they once ignored. The next day, she confronted him. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. She told me later, in a voice stripped of accusation, that she'd finally asked him a question she should have asked months earlier. If things go wrong, she said, what happens to you? He hesitated. That hesitation cost him everything. Within a week, the truth was undeniable. Mark had positioned himself to exit cleanly. No shared risk. No shared fallout. If the company collapsed under scrutiny or litigation, Elena would absorb the consequences. I would be painted as obstructive. Mark would walk away. It was never a partnership. It was opportunism. Elena stopped defending him after that. Not immediately. Not publicly. But the shift was there. She stopped forwarding his messages. Stopped framing decisions as we. Stopped protecting him from questions. And when people stop protecting you, the truth doesn't stay hidden for long. The advisor discovered inconsistencies that couldn't be explained away. Financial movements that violated internal agreements. Clauses activated without mutual consent. Mark tried to justify it. Too late. By the time he realized the leverage he thought he had was gone, the process had moved beyond personalities. It had become procedural, and procedure doesn't care how charming you are. The mediator recommended an independent forensic review. Mark objected. Elena didn't. That was the end. 2 days later, Mark stopped responding entirely. Emails bounced. Calls went unanswered. His office claimed he was traveling. No one believed it. Elena sat across from me during the next session, eyes red, hands folded tightly. I didn't know, she said quietly. I believe you didn't know everything, I replied. That distinction mattered. She nodded. I trusted the wrong person. So did I said. Once. There was no triumph in the moment. Just clarity. The separation terms shifted rapidly after that. Custody discussions focused on stability, not leverage. Financial divisions followed actual contribution and responsibility, not hypothetical narratives. Elena didn't fight it. She didn't apologize either. She looked tired. When the final framework was presented, it was fair, balanced, grounded in reality. Not the outcome she'd planned, but the outcome she could live with. After the meeting, she stopped me in the hallway. I didn't think you'd see it, she said. Any of it. I nodded. That was the plan. She winced. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said. I know, I replied. But intent doesn't erase impact. She didn't argue. That was new. Mark resurfaced briefly after that, through lawyers, requests, explanations, claims of misunderstanding. None of it mattered. The process no longer revolved around him. And when people lose relevance, they lose power. The children adjusted faster than anyone expected. They're resilient when the adults stop using them as currency. Mornings became predictable again. Dinners quieter. Bedtime stories uninterrupted. I didn't tell them everything. They didn't need to know. All they needed to see was consistency. That night, sitting alone in my office, I realized something I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't vindicated. I was steady. Because what I protected wasn't my pride. It was the future. And once you secure that, everything else becomes noise. The final phase was coming. Not confrontation. Not punishment. Closure. And closure doesn't arrive with shouting. It arrives when the truth finishes doing its work. The last meeting didn't feel important while it was happening. That surprised me. After months of tension, preparation, and careful restraint, I expected some kind of emotional release, a sense that something monumental was ending. Instead, it felt procedural. Paperwork was reviewed. Adjustments confirmed. Dates finalized. The mediator spoke in the calm, neutral tone of someone whose job is to close doors without slamming them. Elena sat across from me, composed but hollowed out in a way I hadn't seen before. Not defeated, just emptied of certainty. Mark wasn't there. No one expected him to be. His lawyers submitted a brief statement citing miscommunication and unintended outcomes. The mediator acknowledged it without comment. That was the last time his name was mentioned in the room. When something loses relevance, it stops being discussed. The agreement was fair, not generous, not punitive, balanced in the way outcomes tend to be once emotion is removed from the equation. Shared custody, clear schedules, defined boundaries, no theatrics, no speeches. When it was over, Elena gathered her papers slowly. She didn't look at me at first. I thought I was protecting myself, she said quietly. I didn't realize how much I was risking. I know, I replied. That was all. No apology followed. I didn't ask for one. Some realizations arrived too late to be useful as words. The real ending came weeks later, quietly, when the forensic review concluded. Mark's activities hadn't risen to criminal thresholds, but they had violated contractual obligations and fiduciary standards. Enough to sever partnerships. Enough to follow him. His professional reputation dissolved almost overnight. Clients distanced themselves. Prospective deals vanished. Not because anyone exposed him publicly. Because trust, once questioned, doesn't recover easily. He moved on. So did everyone else. Elena changed, too, in smaller, subtler ways. She stopped trying to explain herself. Stopped framing the past. Stopped leaning on stories that once made things easier. We communicated only about the children. That was enough. Noah and Lily adapted faster than either of us expected. Children don't need perfection. They need predictability. They needed to know who would be there in the morning, who would read at night, who would listen when something felt confusing. I made sure the answer was always clear. Over time, the house felt different. Not quieter, calmer. Work shifted too. I didn't take fewer clients, but I chose them more carefully. I said no more often. I left the office earlier when I could. No one noticed. And that was the point. One evening, months later, I found an old notebook in my desk. The first page held the sentence I'd written on the night everything began to unravel. Understand everything before doing anything. I closed it and put it away. I didn't need it anymore. Because the phase of my life that required vigilance had ended. What replaced it wasn't triumph. It was simplicity. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not confronting Elena earlier. If things could have been different had I spoken up, pushed back, demanded more. Maybe. But I've learned something important in my line of work and in my life. Outcomes aren't shaped by the moment you discover the truth. They're shaped by what you do after. I didn't win because I was smarter or calmer. I won because I stayed grounded while others tried to control outcomes they didn't fully understand. Because I protected what mattered without trying to destroy what didn't. That's the difference between reaction and resolution. Mark thought leverage came from positioning. Elena thought it came from narrative. They were both wrong. Real leverage comes from consistency, from being able to say, calmly, here is what actually happened. No embellishment. No fear. Just facts. Years from now, Noah and Lily won't remember meetings or paperwork or who said what. They'll remember who showed up. And that's enough for me. If you've stayed with this story until the end, thank you for listening. Sometimes the strongest response to betrayal isn't revenge. It's refusing to become someone you don't recognize just to prove a point. I'll see you in the next story.